Welcome to the Robin C. Clark Library at St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Berkeley. This is the Theology of Karl Marx. For those of you accessing the seminar online, we will be meeting every Sunday for the next 8 weeks at 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time in this library at St. Mark's. The seminars will be mastered and posted on the course website as soon after each session as I can put them together. For those who need assistance accessing the seminar, you can email me at Joseph Luff, first name, last name, L-O-U-G-H, @gmail.com. I have 3 objectives during the first seminar. First, I want to deal with the mechanics of the seminar. Second, I would like to give you a sense of where we are going and why. And third, I want to look at the documents I've posted on the seminar website, a piece of chapter 1 of Genesis, a passage from the Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans, the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, and the Chalcedonian Standard, and a chunk of part 3 of Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologica, devoted to the sacraments. So for our purposes, these texts speak to Christian materiality. They speak to bodies. For most of their 2.4 million years of existence, human beings have valued the substances out of which things are composed. How they have valued these things has differed widely from time to time and place to place. Let me admit someone here. Great. How they have valued things has differed widely from time to time and place to place. Dip into any ancient sacred text from any part of the world, and you will discover religious practitioners orienting themselves to the cardinal points on the compass, to rivers and to mountains, to fabrics, to colors, to seasons, stars, lunar cycles, menstrual cycles, crops, migrations, tides, winds, weather patterns, geophysical and astronomical events, foods, prohibited and required, drinks, again, prohibited and required, bodily orientation, erect, facing east, prostate, hands in supplication, in anger, and so on. Large-scale agriculture gives a very small handful of the community the luxury of momentarily forgetting the debt of gratitude they owe to both human and non-human members of their community. At the very least, it required that they embrace stories that helped explain why some of them worked so hard and lived such short lives, while others worked less and lived longer lives. But even the best situated members of the most opulent communities could not fully shake off their dependence on the world of things. For Christians, this dependence on the world of things is, or rather was, especially important. Their God became flesh, and for nearly 14 centuries, Christians confessed that the Palestinian Jew, Jesus, was both, quoting from the Nicene Creed, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, and true man. For reasons that we will need to explore, somewhere in or around the 14th century in Western Europe, Christians began to question whether or how this could be so. Their questioning coincided with a fundamental shift in how human beings valued things. Prior to this shift, human beings valued things on account of the substances out of which these things were composed. After this shift, first in Western Europe and then elsewhere, they increasingly valued things not for the substances out of which they were composed, but for the abstract time consumed in their composition. This shift in how people value things caused a major shift in how they valued God. For 14 centuries, they had valued God for the substances out of which God was composed. How and where this God appeared, what this God did. Afterwards, the application of temporal and spatial metrics to the divine substance grew increasingly problematic. As the substantive value of things became less certain, so too did the substantive value of their God. Only as the seminar progresses will it become clear why people in large numbers came to value things differently. For our purposes, for the moment, it is important for us to appreciate the profound impact this revolution came to play in Christianity. Briefly, it became the foundation for Christians who radically differentiated surface forms of appearance, including the surface form or body of their Lord, from abstract underlying value forms, including Christ's divine nature. From here, this differentiation between surface and value enters mainstream philosophical and theological discourse, first in pietist devotional literature, but then in philosophy more generally. Finally, in its fully elaborated form, the distinction between and relationship of surface form and underlying value form appears in Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. It was around Hegel's phenomenology that Karl Marx erected his critical theory, or could we say his theology, his thinking or his logic about God. Marx was an atheist from a Jewish background, so a Facebook friend recently objected. True. But it is also true that he erected his critical theory in a conceptual universe that was explicitly theological, explicitly Christian, and explicitly incarnational. But before we get there, I want us to appreciate how dramatically the emergence of capitalism in the 14th century Europe reshaped how Christians valued their God. Now, in a moment, I want to offer a sweeping overview of the seminar, just so everyone knows where we are going. But first, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. If you are not able to access this seminar in real time, don't worry, I will post each seminar on the website as soon as I'm able. If anyone objects to having their comments posted for the world to see and hear, you can mute your audio, turn off your camera, or both. To get the Zoom link, you will need to email me, let me know your name, your email, your pronouns, and why you want to participate in the seminar. In return, I will send you a Zoom link. All of the readings are posted in advance. Feel free to work through them or not at your own pace. Each seminar will focus on the readings for that seminar and on their content and context. My aim is to guide, but not to dominate the conversation. The seminar is not rudderless. It is going somewhere, even though at times this may not be clear. To supplement the seminar, I have created a blog site, Marx, Marx 1, that is MARX 1.wordpress.com. We can continue the conversation there as time permits. If any of you have any additional questions about the mechanics, please feel free to email me at my first name last name @gmail.com. For those of you who are here or who are online, are there any questions that you have that I can answer? No? Okay. Let me then offer a sweeping overview of the seminar, which should last 8 weeks, not the overview itself, but the 8 seminars. Again, if you miss a seminar, don't worry, I will post each seminar on the website. Now, in a highly focused way today, I want to review the Christianity all Christians embraced in the 13th century, a deeply material, spatial, and temporal Christianity. Now, next week, we will look at the circumstances under which this deeply material experience of Christianity began to crumble. Why did Christians in large numbers come to question the value of things? In Seminar 3, we will explore 3 sites where the fragmentation of the body is especially notable for Christians: the body of the Virgin Mary, the body of her divine Son, and sacred mirth or laughter. In each of these cases, services that had been venerated began to lose their value. In Seminar 4, we will explore how Christians came to terms with this fundamental shift in value. God's body is disavowed. At the same time, the body of creation is deprived of its sacred status. It is transformed into a mere surface form. Its value is extrinsic, outside of itself. Moreover, communities that do value things are condemned as primitive, superstitious, and backward. The widespread devaluing of bodies is evident in the rapid increase, among other things, the rapid increase in officially sanctioned mass death. In Seminar 5, we again explore how Christians come to terms with this systemic, universal mortification of the flesh. It is at this point that Christians develop and elaborate a theory of divine violence, according to which the violence and terror of their world is evidence of the presence of eternity in time. In Seminar 6, we explore this theory in its most fully developed form in Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Hegel's phenomenology explores the revolutionary violence surging across 18th and 19th century Europe and Europe's imperial holdings. God is in this violence doing something new. We also see how a very young Karl Marx reinterpreted Hegel's incarnational theology, replacing divine violence with revolutionary violence. In Seminar 7, we explore how this violence is supposed to play out. For Hegel, the spirit completes itself in time. For the young Marx, the revolutionary working class completes itself in time. In the 1850s, Marx develops and elaborates an alternative eschatology, an alternative theory of the end times. In Seminar 8, the final seminar, we examine a handful of core passages from Marx's Capital, from which we will attempt to formulate the theology of Karl Marx. So let me pause here and take any questions either from those here or those online. Nothing? Okay. So let's dive into Nicaea, Chalcedon, the Apostles' Creed, and St. Thomas's Summa, part 3, questions 60 through 90. And for this purpose, I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Okay. Here it is. There. Okay. Just that off. That off. Here we go. Can everybody see that? No?
No, we can't see it.
Okay. It says on mine that I'm sharing the screen.
Maybe trying to reshare, maybe since that's open.
Okay. Share the screen, reshare. Can you see that now?
No, it's let's see. No, we can't, sadly.
It says my sharing is paused. So let me go back here. Now it says that it's sharing again.
We can see the top banner of your search engine, but we can't see the windows below it.
Okay. I'm going to try another thing then here. Maybe this will work. I'm going to do something totally radical and open Chrome. Maybe Chrome is better at this than Safari.
I thought I was just taking a theology of Karl Marx seminar, but now you're talking, I mean, this is way outside my box.
Yeah,
Opening Chrome.
I know. Chrome, it's disgusting, but sometimes we need to do disgusting things. Okay, I'm going to try to share again.
Okay.
And new share, and I'm going to do Chrome, and I'm going to share that. Can you see that?
Yes, sir, we can.
Okay, I guess Chrome is better at this, or the folks who are doing this like one extremely wealthy person over another. So here we have the Genesis passage, the passage from the Hebrew sacred text. And I'm wondering if anybody has read this recently or read it before the seminar. I mean, I can read it and you know, then can pick it apart. But it might just be best for us to dive in. I want us to notice, first of all, its rejection of dualism. I don't know that this is a common way of understanding the text, but in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. God created not simply the heavens, not simply the earth. There aren't two gods here, one over the earth and one over the heavens. It's kind of a radical idea to have a God creating both of these separate realms. Maybe they're not so separate after all. Anybody see anything else here that they want to call attention to? The other thing that I want us to see here in this passage from Genesis is all of the metaphors, and maybe they're not simply metaphors, right? Maybe this is how people experienced what they understood of creation, that God moves, that God says things, that things happen because God says things, because God does things, right? I mean, it's kind of amazing to me, because we read this, and what we want to do is we want to make it into poetry, and we want to sort of say, well, this isn't what really happened. But at least in the experience of those who would have first been telling this story, the reason that there are physical material references here is because they're trying to explain, they feel they are explaining the world around them and themselves within it. It's also important, again, to point out that the people who read this would have read and understood that this is good. Right? This isn't the dark world. This isn't the world that emanates from an evil God, and therefore it is material, which is what some people would have believed. It is material, and it is good. And I don't know how many times I've read over the last couple of decades authors who are well-intentioned, who fault the Jewish and Christian understanding of creation for its denigration of the material world. I sometimes wonder whether these people have maybe not read or not looked at these passages very carefully. I also want us to see the spatiality of this world. There's a dome over the earth, evidently the sky, and there are waters above the earth. And we know that there are waters above the earth because that's where water comes from. And we also know that there's water under the earth. And we know that we're standing on land. So we know that the land began to come up out of the earth. And all these spatial metaphors suggest a God that is not uncomfortable with materiality, for which the material world is good. I also want to recognize here the agency of the non-human actors here. Let the earth put forth vegetation. Right? The earth is doing something that it is doing apart from human beings, and it's putting forth vegetation, and it's putting forth animals, and it's putting forth all kinds of life. Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, not let God create each of these individual creatures, but here is a world that is able to, and does create its own environment. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." So well before God sort of hands dominion over to human beings, God is also saying at this point, you guys out there, you be fruitful, even without those crazy human beings, right? You can do this. And the last thing that I really want to sort of identify here is that the human beings that are created here are in relationship with other creatures. And this is simply how, as we'll see from the Romans passage that we'll look at in a moment, this is simply how people understood the material world. This is not wild, crazy environmentalist, stuff. This is how people who are absolutely dependent on the material world for their very existence understand that mutual relationship. And we'll see later on how this is not at all how Mr. Locke will view it later on, or how other 18th century, 17th and 18th century thinkers will view the earth. They will come to view it strictly as an object to be exploited. Okay, and then we come to this extraordinarily important passage from Romans, several centuries later, perhaps as many as 2,000 or 3,000 years later. And the story itself, obviously, the story of Genesis derives from stories that go back decades and decades and decades. Okay. Does anybody have any questions or comments before we move on?
I've always been fascinated with the Genesis text in not necessarily the binary light and dark, male and female, but it seems that the story is indicating a kind of spectrum, that these are the edges of creation, and God also created everything in between. So it wasn't so much this. I'm giving you the playing field, and then things will happen. But it's this indication that God, in God's creative spirit, free spirit, is indicating, maybe by the story itself, or inviting us to think that God isn't just in those times when there is great euphoria and great grief, but God is also in all of those moments of taking a breath, waking up in the morning, going to sleep at night, sharing at table, curating families, those kinds of things. That God is, it's almost a process theology scope that I certainly appreciate. Is that something that you've leaned into or thought about?
Yes, although less in terms of process theology than in terms of Aboriginal relationships among different human and non-human communities. Just that if you're going to tell a story that is reasonably accurate, those dependencies and those interdependencies will come out. But I like your talking about this as a spectrum, and it definitely is a spectrum. Anything else?
I apologize for being a little late. Did you indicate what you prefer to be called?
Oh, I'm generally he, him.
And how about a name you'd like us to
Oh,
use?
Joe is perfectly fine.
Okay,
Yeah.
great, great.
Oh, yeah.
It looks like Daniel has a couple of comments in the chat as well.
Okay. I'm going to look at the chat then because I haven't been looking at it.
I'm glad to articulate it if unless Daniel wants
Yeah,
to
there it is.
liberate his
I see it.
microphone. Okay.
Yeah. The wind of God. What would you say about the holy wind of God, Daniel? Yeah, I'm not sure what I would say about the holy wind of God. Um, I think I have some grasp of its subsequent meaning for different scholars. Um, I would take wind to be a fairly material thing. I feel it on my skin. It blows over homes in some parts of the world and during some seasons. Um, it is refreshing on hot days. Um, but I also want to try to avoid a binary here, insofar as where we're moving is towards Nicaea and Chalcedon, and I'm trying to think about this without division, without distinction, um, and think about the material world as something of value, that might be better understood as social, but certainly not uh, certainly not something that we can't name, that is ineffable, that is beyond speech, that is beyond sensation. And even the wind here that blows over the face of the deep strikes me as something that is really tangible and has movement, and that we feel. But I think it's worth. I appreciate your pointing that out, because I think it all of these metaphors and these ways of talking about God um, are not unproblematic. In fact, they are problematic, and in some ways, Chalcedon and Nicaea don't remove that problematic. They in another way force it, which is interesting, because a lot of theoretical systems try to resolve this problem, which may not be able to be solved. Maybe it's not supposed to be solved. I don't know. Uh, but I will keep an eye on chat now. Now I know to keep an eye on chat. So then, brothers and sisters, we are debtors not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh, for if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. All of which sounds quite, ascetic, and sounds like a mortification of the flesh. Sounds as though we are already in a disembodied world, until, of course, we get down to verse 18. I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory about to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. Now, I'm sure Elaine Pagels would have a field day with this passage. Are the children of God about to be revealed, and in what way? But what I want us to focus on is the sense that Paul and the community to which he's writing and creation are all a part of the same community. That the struggles that they face in Roman-occupied Palestine as members of a minority Jewish sect are tangible. And Paul believes that the struggle that they're engaged in and the pain that they're enduring and the suffering they're enduring is something that they share with creation. For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but of the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. So there's this sense for Paul, as for most Jews, in fact, I would venture to say nearly all Jews, in the first century, that in this part of the world, in Roman-occupied Palestine and the Mediterranean more generally, that they're in a common struggle to obtain their liberty, and creation is also struggling to obtain its liberty, and the two are in relationship to one another. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains until now, and not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly while we wait for adoption, and then the redemption of our bodies. And this again suggests not that the verse way up there in verse 12 that talks about the flesh and the spirit as these two separate realms. Maybe these don't mean what they've come to mean. Maybe the body and the redemption of the body is a metaphor that also refers to flesh, but flesh in a very different way. And we will deal, when we look at the pietist literature some weeks from now, that it came to be viewed among pietists, and even more among those who were subject to the first awakening, that mortification of the flesh took on a really morbid quality of harming oneself, of self-mutilation, and of as evidence of God's Spirit, rather than, as this suggests, the redemption of our bodies. Are there any questions about this passage? I mean, I'm not attempting to offer exhaustive interpretations, but I do want to focus here on this experience of the flesh and of materiality that is often degraded or ignored, at least in the modern period.
what intrigues me with this passage is that chapter 8 closes with the incarnation, and it's that beautiful, maybe potentially a hymn, um, who is to condemn? Who will separate us from the love of Christ? In verse 35, will hardship or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? Skip down to 37. No. In all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. This idea where uh, Christ is taking on all of the materiality of creation, of the passage that you pointed out to us in 18 to 25, that has become transmuted into the Christ figure. And I think that it is appropriate that that Paul switches. It's not Jesus Christ; it's Christ Jesus. This one who then is the one who takes on all of the pain and hardship of the world in order for it to be transformed. I think that's a maybe the answer to the growing pangs, or the birth pangs of something new that God is up to in this text.
And yet I still experience pain.
Yeah, exactly. And so the question is, where is Christ in that pain? Which for Paul, I mean, if we're just looking at that Pauline, then we come ever closer to Christ. Is that the invitation for Paul? Does it mean we don't have enough faith? Where does that end up, right? If we still feel pain.
Yeah. It's a hard one. I'm not sure.
That's the best answer. Yeah.
Yeah. Although it will come back and bite us in a big way. So we just need to hold off a little bit. Are we ready for Nicaea? Okay. So let's go to Nicaea now.
Yeah, let's dig deep.
Yeah. All right. And I got this from the Protestant Reformed churches. There you go. We need more Protestant Reformed churches. Or maybe not. Anybody see something here that they want to point out before I try to point to the things that struck me? Okay. Again, we find the rejection of dualism. God, the Father, Almighty, is the maker of both heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible. The central position in the creed of the Palestinian Jew Jesus, who is both born in time and in space, a particular person, who was executed, who died and was buried, who as this particular person is also God of God, light of light, true God of true God, begotten, not made. This incarnate God can still be located spatially and temporally. And if you don't believe me about this, you just have to look at medieval iconography. I have seen in such iconography Jesus at God's right hand. There he is, at the Father's right hand. And he's going to come, right, from a place into a world where he isn't in this same physical way, right? He's going to come and judge the living and the dead, and also those who have not yet been born. So we're talking about sometime in the future. whose kingdom will have no end. God is present now both in the community and in community with the Father and the Son as God the Spirit. God is present in this community in such a manner as to lend authority to this community. And I don't, my intention here is not to ignore or gloss over the highly political dimension of this document or the ecumenical creeds in general. But it is also to then suggest that the institutional character of the church is not something from which, or that it's not something that the church disavows. Its own materiality, its own substance, its own institutional reality is validated by the Spirit. It believes. That is, that's what people believe. Christians believe. They believe that the church can withhold, for example, the sacrament, and that this will have disastrous consequences from those from whom the sacrament is withheld. There's a palpable reality of the Spirit's presence that takes on an institutional form. So God is present in such a manner as to lend authority to this community, composed not only of the living, but also of the dead and those who will come in the future. There is, in other words, a way of spatializing and temporalizing the divine, which is not problematic for this community. To speak about God the Son being at God the Father's right hand poses no difficulty. Whereas I would say it poses huge hurdles for people today, including myself, right? To think about, a Palestinian Jew, irrespective of whether or not this Jew looks like me or looks like a North African, at some other divine being's right hand is hugely problematic, spatially and temporally. So a little more than a century later, the Creed of Chalcedon further specifies the divine. And it's worth wondering, why? Why do we need a further clarification? Let me suggest that part of the reason here is that it is really easy to slip from one side to the other. It is very easy to say, no, God is not flesh. God is God. Let's do the old Zoroastrian thing again, okay? Light and darkness, matter and light. Right? Let's go in that direction. And the leadership within the church continues to say one person, one substance, not parted or divided into two persons. It continues to say, without confusion, without change, without division, without separation. This is where we are. And so the dualism that many people today in particular will ascribe to the church simply is not there. or if it's there, those in leadership are doing their darndest to say, well, yeah, but no, without division, without separation, without distinction. Both God and man. And, maybe ironically or not, in the 5th century as well, in Gaul, we have a third document that's kicking around, and ends up being sort of the summary that all of us recite on Sundays, and is intended once again to reinforce the spatiality and temporality of God. Crucified, dead, and buried, descended into hell. And you want to say, or I want to say, it is already by the 5th century somewhat anachronistic, because when it was confessed in the 3rd century or in parts of the 4th century, this is the confession that sent people into the arena. This person you killed is still alive and will come back and will judge you. And what's more, there's a whole community out there of people who the Spirit has enlightened. It's called the Holy Catholic Church. And God is building a future out of this community. And all of us are going to rise someday. And you, Romans, are not going to be happy when God comes back, because heads are going to roll. So, the Romans had every reason to take those who made this confession and say, well, you might be right, but I'll place my money on this guy not coming back, and you're never coming back. Is there anything else that we want to look at in these texts before moving on?
If I'm talking too much, please just press the fast forward button. Yeah, I'm intrigued about the Chalcedonian Creed, this homoousion, that one upsilon that transformed East and West, the Roman Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church. That great split happened over that upsilon. For the Western Church, it was the Son was of the same substance as God. And for the Eastern Church and other Orthodox sects at the time, God was the same substance as the Son. And I think this substance, I'm trying to pick up on the materiality here. I really appreciate you pushing us to think in this way. I'm not sure that I've done this kind of work, so I'm so appreciative. But I'm wondering, where does that materiality come up for you in this both and, fully divine, fully human, God and Son as one, God, or the Son of God? It's this really the beginnings of the Trinity, right? We don't get the Trinity biblically. This is an institutional model that frankly, gives clergy people our rise to being divas. That when we break the bread, we are acting as Christ behind the table. And that when we are in the moment of Mass and breaking that bread, it is like Christ is with us. And we are the representation of Christ. Therefore, men are the only ones who can be ordained, and all of that. So I'll stop rambling because I think that's a field day for me. But I'm wondering, this co-materiality, if you will, and maybe that's the wrong approach. But I'd love to hear your response.
I kind of approach it from the back door, because I'm asking the question: what were those present at the councils? Why did they feel threatened by these different movements? I mean, if you can, the way that I conceptualize this is the all of the trouble that the Holy Spirit unleashed on Pentecost, by saying, you guys now have the Spirit. What do you think is happening? You're the prophets, you're the teachers, you're those to whom God has revealed God's self. And they go off and they go to their communities, and they don't all agree at what they're experiencing. And they come out with some really wild ideas. I mean, Peter in 2 Peter thinks that among those who have wild ideas is Paul, right? He says, some people have taken what Paul's saying, and has twisted it in really bad ways. Well, he kind of did that, maybe not intentionally, but that was surely the result of observing in the communities where he traveled, that the people of all sorts were in fact prophets, and people of all sorts were prophesying different things in different places. And that could get out of hand. And so, when Constantine says, so what the hell do you believe? Who are the people who I should be killing and sending to the lions, and who are the people who I should be venerating? That's a really hard question to answer. And they say, Constantine, you have this wrong. It's both end. It's not, we're not going to come down on one side or the other. And you sort of sense that, or I sense that in the ways that the Western Church and the Eastern Church have renewed a dialogue with one another over what it is they mean by the one substance. And I would suggest that we can broaden that discussion and even say to those of neighbor faiths, what do we mean when we talk about divine materiality, and incarnation? And it strikes me that one of the things we might mean by that is we think this is consequential. Right? I'm recalling a class I was teaching in the South Bay on the history of religions, and it was the class was, I would say, probably 80% Muslim. And the students wanted to know what difference being a Christian made. What difference does it make? And I think that's a good question for us to ponder. Okay, if it's okay, I want to leap ahead 8 centuries or so and dive into at least a few sections of the Summa. This is a part of the Summa, part 3, that has always intrigued me, because I think that the question of the 16th century was, how can God be in anything or anyone, or how can God be anywhere? And for Thomas, the question is almost the reverse. Why isn't God everywhere and in everything? So let's look at this briefly. So, what is a sacrament? You know, the the question of sacramentality, it refuses to go away. What is it that we are communicating in the sacrament? Is it simply a symbol of something else? Is it something that we could just as easily take by ourselves, or is it like having a good meal with one another? And for at least St. Thomas, the issue is somewhat more to the point. Why isn't everything sacramental? Right. So first, just a few sections here just to get us into it. Signs are given to men to whom it is proper to discover the unknown by means of the known. Consequently, a sacrament, properly so called, is that which is the sign of some sacred thing pertaining to man, so that, properly speaking, a sacrament, as considered by us now, is defined as being the sign of a holy thing so far as it makes us holy. Are you all familiar with the basic format of the Summa? This object, you have these statements, and then you have a series of objections, and then you have replies to those objections. It is scholastic, right? And brilliant, right? If you almost wish, if you could, that Foucault had taken the time to offer a commentary on the Summa, but because it's brilliant. I mean, it's brilliant in so many different ways. Consequently, a sacrament is a sign that is both a reminder of the past, the passion of Christ, and an indication of that which is effected in us by Christ's passion, grace, and a prognostic, that is, a foretelling of future glory. And interestingly enough, what St. Thomas is wrestling with here is the explosion in pilgrimages, the explosion in relics, the explosion in visits to sacred streams and forests, and the belief among Christians that it's not just 7 things, it's all of these things, right? The hand, the clothing, the altar, the everything can be a sacrament. And so, you know, St. Thomas isn't saying that these things cannot convey grace. but that they are not obligated. They don't naturally, they don't, within the community of faith, they will not always convey grace. But I want to run down here. I guess it's around page 3162 in this online version, that we get into the real interesting stuff. There it is. The number of sacraments. And then, of course, he has all of these objections where he identifies good reasons why there's only one sacrament, right? There's only one sacrament, and that's Jesus. But perhaps there are two sacraments corresponding to punishment and guilt and the rectification of punishment and guilt. Or perhaps there are three sacraments. And he offers good reasons for why there might be three sacraments. Or that there's no sacrament. Right? There's nothing that can replace Jesus, right? Or on the other hand, there are more than 7 sacraments, right? Objection 6. And you can see already in the 13th century that divine materiality has become extremely problematic. But it's problematic not because people don't believe that God can be present in the material world or convey grace through substances. It's problematic because people don't know what those substances are, or they have questions about what those substances are. Anybody else who's read this or who senses the direction of St. Thomas's argument here? Anybody have any insights, points they want to make? Well, let me then point out just a few more things. Why are there 7 alone sacraments? Because these are the signs that will lead to the perfection of man. And it's astonishing, right? That he's saying, look at this, look at the cross, look at redemption, look at the specificity of the sign, not that it's a magical talisman, but that it actually conveys what it says it's conveying. And it does that because we're looking at these acts of God on our behalf. So the specificity for Thomas is important. It's not just that you look to whom it is administering the sacrament. It makes a difference what it refers to and what it contains. It contains God. Which God? The God who died on the cross and who is raised. The sacraments can be mediated by the Spirit, but they refer to the Son. Right? They refer to redemption, emancipation, perfection. So then he goes into his lengthy explanation for why that's the case. why it is these seven are references to the economy of redemption in Jesus. Now, I think all of us would admit, or at least I will admit, that this is a really strange world. And most of us, including myself, would not want to occupy this world. It's pre-scientific. It has very few of the amenities that we enjoy. And yet there's also relationship to materiality, divine materiality, and other materiality that that deserves our attention. This is not a world on its way to a climate emergency. It couldn't be, right? It's too attentive to its need for water, clean air, crops, the harvest. I mean, this is its very foundation. And even in sprawling empires towards the east, because the West is sort of the armpit of the world, right? At this point, when people in the East were building magnificent buildings and writing literature, people who looked like me were grunting and wearing animal skins. But all of them, even in the most opulent, once the granaries are full, that's it. You have to conquer more territory in order to get more value. It's substance, it's land, it's grain, it's human beings. And those limits are about to be erased. So less than a century after St. Thomas finishes his Summa, divine materiality will begin to disintegrate, and begin to disintegrate fairly rapidly. In many ways, Thomas is already hinting that there are huge problems. Christians in large numbers will come to question the value of surface forms of appearance. They will increasingly come to view value as something that is immaterial, abstract, and transcendent. Now, why they begin to do that is still the subject of serious debate, and yet where it isn't ideologically sort of twisted, there's a growing consensus that it wasn't the brisk trade around the Mediterranean that changed things. That had been going on for several centuries, with or without the Northern and Western European Dark Ages, so-called Dark Ages. The Mediterranean is doing fine. Asia is doing remarkably well at this time. So it's not just material wealth that brings about this change, with no offense meant for Mr. Brodel and his circle. The change occurred in the north, in the place that we least expected it would come, because this is the most sort of primitive and backward and least well-developed part of the planet. And yet, within a century, it will already be spreading south and east, and eventually will spread west. So next week, we're going to look at why this might have happened. Are there any final questions before we sign off?
I haven't studied much of Thomas Aquinas. I am very intrigued about his context, and your last few sentences there about the global perspective is exceedingly interesting to me, especially in thinking about what was behind how people came from this uh, backwards space and were able to convince these highly intellectual, highly engaged, highly communal uh, spaces and places with this idea of this homoousion. Here's this, this Jesus character, right? It's fascinating. So a two-part question. First is any thoughts on maybe we'll get this in our next session together. I'd love to know your thoughts on that. And second, is there a book or an article you think would be helpful to figure out maybe some more context into this 12th and 13th century global perspective?
Well, I think that Jacques Le Goff is helpful, or has been helpful to me, and more importantly, Jacques Le Goff, who we'll be reading a section of next week, is helpful. And then if you do a sort of a literature search, you would find all sorts of people who have drawn upon Le Goff and his research. Among them, Caroline Walker Bynum, Donna Spivey Ellington, a number of scholars who have sought to further problematize the late Middle Ages. And this is crazy. This is crazy time, and as we'll see in session 3, we associate walking statues and bleeding wafers and things like that with the darkest of the Dark Ages, and yet they actually proliferate at the end, after the Renaissance has fully sort of unveiled itself. Divine materiality is really struggling, you might say, and this is also when the worst of the pogroms until the modern era begin to spread across Europe, with all of the stories about sacrifice of children and things like that. Bodies are at risk towards the end of the Middle Ages in a way that they simply were not. Earlier on, and the actual statistics on this, which we won't look at until until session 4, are pretty astonishing. The number of those who fall victim to officially sanctioned mass death begins to explode only in the early modern period, which then offers, I think, an insight into divine materiality. What happens when the sacred vacates the material world? it you could say that it becomes Francis Bacon's dream landscape if everything can be excavated and torn apart and dissected without any fear that you are violating a sacred boundary. Well, why not? And I have to continually be reminded myself that we're not talking about non-Christians who are engaged in this. We're talking about Christians. This is what Christians are going to be doing. They're going to be killing one another in unprecedented numbers. And that coincides with a shift in how they understand the value of the material world. Is there anything else that we need to pay attention to? Well, thank you all for being here and coming, and all of you here. And if you want to drop down to St. Mark's on a Sunday afternoon at 3, be my guest. And it's been a joy to at least talk about these things with you. And feel free to email me if you have any other questions. And we'll meet again next Sunday at 3. Great.
All right. Thanks so much, Jules. Okay.
Yeah, very good.
Okay. Bye. Bye.
Bye.